Hola y bienvenido. Me llamo doctora Andrews. I'm Dr. Andrews from Columbia University. Yo estudié español en la escuela secundaria. Yo soy de India, pero yo estoy practicando todos los días. So gracias. Um, I'm here today as an ALS expert from New York City at Columbia University and the director of clinical trials and also a co-chair of a clinical trials consortium. So I'll try to talk about some of those initiatives from that consortium and also talk about some experimental therapies that are in expanded access. So without further ado, I will now move on to the presentation. So what is Neals? Neals stands for Northeast ALS Consortium, but I will tell you that we might be going through a name change. We still will be Neals, but it will stand for something else. It's a surprise in October for our annual meeting. My co-chair is Dr. James Berry from Mass General Hospital in Boston. And so Neals is a clinical trial network. It spans most of United States and Canada. That's where most of the sites are, but we've grown into other areas, including Europe and India and also Asia, in Japan. And so that means that we've also included collaborations with consortiums that are outside. And so that has made Neals more of a global consortium and a partner with other consortiums across the world. We bring broad ALS trial expertise. That was the origin of why Neals was developed. And as we did clinical trials and trained researchers, we then began to include people with experience, lived experience with ALS, the government entities that fund research, pharmaceutical companies, and of course, nonprofit organizations to help advocate for ALS. And so all of this together has allowed us to bring very good, high quality clinical trials. So we were established 30 years ago, but since then we have grown to do many things. And so we do clinical trials, but we also do a lot of member training. So training researchers, training scientists, training research staff. We also now do a clinical research learning institute, which is one of our prized education programs for people living with ALS. We have subcommittees that kind of focus on different aspects of clinical care in ALS. And we do a lot of now community engagement and community webinars to help provide education as topics evolve in our landscape. And we also do a lot of scientific advisory board meetings, and we also work with industry sponsors or pharmaceutical companies to do clinical trials. And of course, our biggest event is the annual meeting that occurs in October, where we bring everybody together. So some of those subcommittees, so I mentioned that we do clinical trials, but we have committees that are formed within this big consortium to focus on different aspects of clinical care and clinical trials. And all of this feeds back to improving outcomes measured in clinical trials, clinical trial design, and also clinical care for people living with ALS. One of our special qualities in our consortium is that we have a biorepository. It is now something that we work very closely with existing repositories, but I put it here so that anyone, any researcher in the world can have access, especially investigators at academic institutions can have access to samples if they're doing research to define biomarkers or look at particular markers in spinal fluid or blood. Now, our operations team, we're a big organization, 30 years old, but we have 4 employees. And so Carly is our program director. Bev Smits is our associate program director. We have an administrative coordinator, Jenny Heinley, and then Christina Smith, our communications coordinator. And they work day in and day out very hard for the Neals operations. The executive committee is a peer-elected committee, and it's mostly US-based physicians and from a variety of institutions. So people are nominated and then they're elected by the membership. We also have a scientific advisory board, which also provides input to ongoing clinical development programs or investigator-initiated trials. They actually do welcome the opportunity to work with industry sponsors. And so sometimes the pharmaceutical companies may be in the preclinical development program and they come to the scientific advisory board, or they're maybe in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but we try to make sure that they prioritize the information and the design to be patient-friendly, patient-centric, but also with the strongest amount of evidence and science to support the rationale to carry the clinical development forward. In addition to the development and the scientific advisory board, the Neals Executive Committee do evaluate programs. So sometimes pharmaceutical companies or investigators will come with their projects and they want partnership with the consortium. And what the consortium does is provide support with clinical trial design, provide investigator meetings, information sharing through webinars and community engagement. And we really want those clinical trials to recruit as fast as possible so we can get the answer as quickly as possible about whether something works or not. So this is just an example of some ongoing Neals affiliated trials. Some of these trials are US, Canada, some of them are actually global, but we provide support in different phases of clinical development. And I'll talk a little bit more about expanded access, but these are a few of the Neals affiliated expanded access programs that are funded through the National Institute of Health, the government funding for expanded access in the United States. Now, Neals has expanded to form a couple of other groups, working groups. So because information is moving very quickly, we have a Neals Information and Community Education Group, which we call NICE, Simpática. And so the committee here helps to provide information and try to break down breaking news or hot topics. So for example, there's a lot of discussion about people thinking about epidemiological factors or environmental factors that cause ALS. There's been some reports throughout the year, this year even, of clusters of people developing ALS, and there was an article that was published. So this committee joins with the authors and other people in the community to do this webinar to kind of break down that information so that everyone can understand the publication or understand any kind of breaking news that comes out for clinical trials. Partly because of the growth of our consortium and because the United States is made up of many people from different countries, often countries will reach out to people who are from that country. For example, I'm from India, and so Indian investigators have reached out to me to ask how can they build a consortium in India? How can we mentor them to develop clinical care centers with standardized practice? How can they bring pharmaceutical companies into their country and region? And how can they bring clinical trials? So this is a set of us, but there's many people involved, but that kind of forced us to think about how to collaborate more globally. So Neals joined other consortiums globally, and the International Alliance was very important in trying to bring us all together in almost like a global summit last year in December at the international meeting. And so we had consortiums from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, and Europe all sit together and think about priorities that we can think about globally. One of those is actually how to bring standardization of care, genetic testing, and clinical trials to the global south. So Latin America is a high focus of trying to develop that, and we want the consortiums that, like Neals, to be able to help and mentor doctors and researchers that are in Latin America to make sure that we can try to get trials down there and include as many people as possible, and also improve and optimize care so that we all have the same standard of care. And that's a big goal, and lots of different factors that are different between regions. But knowing that we have one common goal, we can work together to try to make it as ideal as possible for every person living with ALS globally. In doing that, Neals has learned over time that we have to incorporate the experience of people living with ALS. And how do we do that? Well, we have now an advisor to the executive committee that is nominated and give us advice on our strategies and initiatives. We have the ALS Clinical Research Institute, which I also mentioned, and they graduate a formal curriculum and they become ALS research ambassadors. So they then mentor other people living with ALS or caregivers when they're newly diagnosed. They actually go and do advocacy for ALS research and ALS clinical care. They'll do webinars, they'll propose topics. We also have the Patient Advisory Committee, which also is a specific committee that provides strategic initiatives and input to the executive committee. And we also try to make sure that people living with ALS and their caregivers are involved as early as possible in any clinical trial that's planned so that the clinical trial is as patient-centric as possible. So focusing on the needs of the patient, the feasibility of someone going through the clinical trial assessments, trying to make sure the design is favorable from the point of view of someone living with ALS. So with all that, the consortium has been very active in trying to make sure we protect research funding. So in the United States, we were very grateful. I always say that ALS is not incurable. It's essentially underfunded. And so the more money that we can get resourced into research, we can definitely push faster to develop biomarkers, develop new targets, develop new experimental therapies, and hopefully come to a cure. So one of those initiatives was trying to get to our government agencies to advocate for a legal law that helps push more money into ALS research, both clinical research and basic research. So ACT for ALS, that's the it's the Accelerating Access to Critical Therapies for ALS, was passed in December 2021 in the United States. And that has funded a couple of key initiatives since 2022. So we're about 2 years in or 3 years into this. So it provides money for grants for research therapies for ALS. So there was a heavy emphasis on access to investigational therapies, and many people living with ALS in the United States were not eligible for clinical trials as we look for more early stage individuals to participate in clinical trials. So there was a heavy input on trying to figure out how to operationalize or try to provide expanded access. And so that the grants provide some funding for that. It also provided funding for public-private partnerships. So what does that mean? It means that the government agencies and entities then that are involved in drug development. For the United States, it's the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. They provide the review for potential approvals for new treatments for ALS. It's the National Institute of Health that provides funding for research, both basic research and clinical research. And it's also an organization called the National Academies of Science. Now, this is an independent group that is put together to identify gaps in the field and recommend areas where government can fund. So, for example, if equipment needs coverage or medication needs coverage, and that's a major barrier for people living with ALS, they would recommend that the government needs to find a way to find coverage or change policy. Or if there's a gap in assistive technology to help people living with ALS, they'll identify that as a gap and maybe point that towards the National Institute of Health to say you should create a funding opportunity for assistive technology. So these public-private partnerships that include people living with ALS, caregivers, physicians, and researchers, along with the government entities, create this coordinated effort. It's very important, and I think it's underestimated how much impact that partnership is, because educating the entities or the organizations that, especially government organizations that are involved in research funding and getting drugs approved, is very critical. And ALS has struggled for a long time in the United States to get attention. But when we got ACT for ALS passed, we were able to create these partnerships and kind of coordinate a lot of the efforts that were kind of smaller scale in the United States. Another is that the FDA actually was funded to create a proactive action plan. What are they going to do to try to prioritize potential new drugs for ALS and other neurodegenerative diseases, and what the steps are to kind of make sure there's priority in evaluating those drugs and providing support for those clinical development programs. And then there's a basic science research program that's funded through the FDA. Because remember, we still have to understand the biology. One of the key things that came out of this Act for ALS is the funding for expanded access. So I focus a little bit on CNM-AU8. This is a program that I am the principal investigator for. So I received grant funding to provide expanded access. Now, because the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Neurological Disorders, NINDS, gives these grants, expanded access traditionally has been just to provide access to an experimental therapy in the setting of a serious life-threatening condition that has exhausted all treatment. So it's really trying to get another treatment when you've exhausted all treatments and it's not helping your condition. But because the NIH is a research funding organizations, these projects are not just simply to provide drug to ALS patients. We have to learn something from them. So there's research hypotheses embedded in all of these projects that are funded by the government. That's very important because it's very different from a traditional expanded access program. This means that not only do we provide the drug, but we also evaluate biomarkers. So we collect serum, we're collecting ALS functional rating scale, we're measuring breathing, and we're doing exploratory analyses to see if there's any efficacy. So in this study, everyone receives drug, and the comparison for efficacy will be predicted algorithms for their potential outcomes or virtual outcome, or sometimes they call it digital twin. There's lots of different lingos in these in the world of AI or predictive algorithms. There's also historical matched controls that you can do efficacy analysis. Of course, gold standard is a controlled trial to determine efficacy of a drug, and Clean Nanomedicine is intending to do a phase 3 clinical trial globally. So that's coming, they're planning that. For the expanded access program, CNM-Au8 is catalytically active gold nanocrystals. I wish there was an easier way to say that, but essentially it's a purple liquid that has gold small nanoparticles in it, and it's supposed to enhance this intracellular energy. There's 7 centers that are academic centers across the United States and 1 virtual site. So this is one of the really neat things or really unique things about this particular program, because we're going to enroll in all 50 states virtually. So essentially every person living with ALS in all 50 states has access to this expanded access program, this particular project. So just quickly, when I said CNM-Au8 is the experimental therapy, it's gold nanocrystals. What it does is it gets into the cells. It's not gene therapy. It doesn't remove proteins. It's simply a molecule that gets in, and it enhances the chemical reaction so that NADH turns into NAD. And NAD is important because it helps the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the motor neuron. And mitochondrial dysfunction is well known as a problem that causes motor neuron death. So if we can improve the survival of mitochondria, we can improve the survival of the motor neuron. So that's the hypothesis for this particular experimental therapy. It's already completed 2 controlled phase 2 studies. It did not meet, I want to be clear, so the primary endpoints, secondary endpoints for both studies were not met. So it did not meet its primary and secondary endpoints. However, pre-specified exploratory endpoint was this time to clinical worsening. So in both Rescue ALS, which was a study that was done in Australia, and the Healy ALS platform showed similar delay to time to ALS clinical worsening with the 30 milligram dose. So that's the dose that's going to be carried to the phase 3, and the expanded access program will be a companion study to that phase 3 study. So this is the aim, basically to evaluate the safety and efficacy of CNM-Au8 in non-clinical trial eligible people living with ALS. And then, of course, we're, as I mentioned before, collecting biomarkers, employing prediction algorithms, and really testing the feasibility of complete remote enrollment. It sounds so easy, but it is very difficult to get to really remote areas of the United States. We are incorporating in the in-clinic, so you'll see dark blue spots. Dark blue is like when they're in clinic. Sometimes we can do remote visits for the patients that are enrolled in the academic centers. So we try to make the visits a little bit easy for the people who have to come to the actual clinic. But there's a cohort of people that are totally remote. So we send people out to draw blood. We send people out to do the assessments. So that means that the virtual site, which is called Synapticure, is enrolling people from all 50 states. And so, for example, we have one patient in Alaska, and it takes a plane. We have to fly people there. They have to take a boat for 2 hours to get to the person and do the assessments. But that person has never had a chance to go to an ALS center or never participated in ALS clinical trials. So in that way, we've been able to use the government funding to provide more access to that for people living with ALS throughout the United States. And the yellow spots or the yellow points are the in-person clinic centers that are enrolling as well. And what we see so far, I presented this data at the American Academy meeting in April. What we see so far, so there's 180 participants enrolled. It's fully enrolled, but we did not actually try to control how many patients were in the brick and mortar, that's BNM, brick and mortar, or in-clinic participants, and decentralized or virtual participants, but it actually fell half and half. And the biggest difference, so the demographics or the patient characteristics are very similar, with the exception of the fact that the geographical isolation, meaning the distance from the nearest clinical trial center, is much larger for the people who are virtually enrolled. So if they didn't have this virtual option, they would not have an option at all. And then the other is this ADI, Area Deprivation Index. This is an index that tells you that the socioeconomic factors that are in play, and we're able to get to people who have less access and less resources when we do a virtual enrollment. So far, we don't have any data yet to present results, but as we get more data, we'll present it. And just to kind of highlight just a few other additional EAPs or expanded access program, Pridopamine is fully enrolled, and that has 45 sites, 200 patients are enrolled, and they're taking a pill twice a day. Pridopamine is a sigma-1 receptor agonist, and it's intended to slow down disease progression. RAPA 501 is actively recruiting, and this is an autologous T-cell therapy. T cells are known to be not functioning properly in ALS, and we think that if we can get healthy T regulatory cells into the people living with ALS, we can actually target nerve inflammation, calm that down, and hopefully create slowing of disease progression. So there's 10 ALS centers. This is actually a difficult study to do because you need the partnership of people who specialize in hematology and oncology. And you have to then get the blood and then send it to the company. They manufacture healthy T regulatory cells, and then they give IV infusion at the center every 6 weeks. So it's a difficult study to do as a researcher, but it's also a difficult study for people living with ALS to participate in. The newest one is an expanded access program with ibutylast. Ibutylast is another molecule targeting nerve inflammation. It's a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, and there's an ongoing phase 3, but it just launched, and it's planned to be done in 15 ALS centers with a target enrollment of 200 individuals living with ALS. And people need to go to widetrial.com to register their interest. So when you go to the website of the United States, you register, and then the clinical research organization will contact people to let them know that there's a slot open. The government funding, this is the last topic. Government funding has been very essential in trying to create a natural history consortium. So the natural history, the longitudinal collection of data, is one of the things that we've been doing I've been doing ALS for 20 years. And we always do it with a couple of centers. It's a couple hundred patients. Then it becomes difficult to sustain the repository. Funding becomes an issue. And so we've done it in smaller scale, but this is the first largest consortium of natural history data that's being collected, and it's government funded. It will take existing repositories and synergize it with this particular longitudinal prospective natural history data collection. Why is this important? Well, today I can't cure ALS, but if I get enough samples in a large scale and evaluate the blood and evaluate the urine and evaluate the clinical data, I may be able to figure out what to target, what may be a better target, and maybe have a better drug that actually has a bigger impact on the disease or possibly cure the disease. So in tomorrow, this work today is actually to help people of tomorrow. And the real key aspect of it is that it's being launched with knowledge that there's existing repositories, and we're trying to kind of make everything into one big collaborative consortium. And it'll be open for researchers. So once the data is in there, the beauty of this is that it'll be open. It'll be an open repository managed by the NIH for any researcher to access. And there'll be a common portal to access in the future once we collect all the data. So there'll be 2,000 people enrolled in this particular natural history study. We are also collecting for the first time multi-center pre-symptomatic individuals carrying who are at risk for ALS, and also controls. So we're basically trying to accelerate research outcomes, integrate data that exists already with new data, and then trying to create accessibility. So this also, you can do remote enrollment. And we're also trying to incorporate new outcomes and new techniques. So remote consenting, trying to create a speech data bank, creating this biorepository. So all those expanded access programs I showed you will go to the same biorepository as this study. So it's creating this massive repository. And then, of course, home assessments, digital patient-reported outcomes, PROs, and alignment with other studies. So I said all this why? It was long and drawn out, but I explained it to explain how important funding is for ALS research. And so we've made transformational change in the field of ALS in the United States because we had been fortunate to receive federal funding. So Act for ALS increased the amount of money that we have for research. And essentially in 2024, we had 300 million US dollars just for ALS research. And so this is what's really made our field change dramatically in the last 2 years. This has allowed us to do flexible trial designs, remote collection, feasibility of virtual or decentralized clinical trials or expanded access, trying to use virtual or synthetic controls. But this information that's being collected with the federally funded research is very rigorous. It's collected, it's validated, and it's monitored. We are collecting standard functional rating scales like the ALS functional rating scale and survival data and biomarkers, and they employ a lot of regulatory standard. So I just listed here, clean expanded access is the first attempt at a fully remote enrollment across the United States. Pradopidine actually brought up new sites. So we have more clinical trial sites that'll be ready for future clinical trials. And RAPA has brought increased experience and expertise of ALS and cell therapy to be merged because it was very few centers that had the expertise to do that. And this will be all kind of open science, able for future researchers across the world to actually access in the future once that repository is full with the samples. So I emphasized all this to tell you, and I know it's no surprise to anybody globally, that the funding environment in the United States is a little uncertain. And I work at Columbia University, so I know firsthand. We've been fortunate to hold on to our ALS research grants, and we're really grateful for that. And we hope that that continues with the federal government. But others have been impacted, which could potentially delay discoveries, interrupt ongoing research. One of the hardest hit areas is this loss of funding for young investigators. So a lot of those grants have been limited across the United States. But of course, Columbia University has been hit the hardest alongside our colleagues at Harvard University. Things were getting better. And then this I just pulled from the internet today from Washington Post. So yesterday, we had been told that there's going to be another pause on the funding. So even if you have a grant, sometimes the money isn't coming. So it's very important to include advocacy and shared advocacy goals across organizations, especially in each country. So what we did as the Neals Consortium is created an organization forum. So us as researchers are very limited in going to the government and directly advocating, but we can work together with our advocacy organizations to create initiatives to protect research funding. So these are some of the US-based nonprofit. Actually, almost everybody has participated in these meetings where we explain the situation, and they have come together to figure out how to create plans if federal funding is lost for some of our government-funded repositories, create plans, and they have programs for funding young investigators should they lose their government funding career development grants, and also trying to prioritize sharing of information of potential funding opportunities, grants that are already funded, and trying to make sure that we have good information that's up to date globally on preclinical research and clinical trials. So that's it only started February 28th this year, because that's when things started. And it is very much, we are very much involved in all of it. We're going to be talking about all of this at our annual Neals meeting. So everyone is invited to come. People living with ALS and their caregivers can register virtually, and it's free to access. So we've been able to do that. And so that's going to be in October of this year. So, and I think we are also, as Neals, going to be participating in the PACTALS meeting in September as a global meeting. We've had one virtual meeting in April to also talk about the global initiatives while we try to survive here in the United States for ALS research funding. And so we've been fortunate for the funding. It's transformed our field, and hopefully it stays. So that was my attempt at explaining 30 years of history in 50 minutes or 30 minutes. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews. That was excellent. Thank you for sharing that. We know it's a holiday today in the US, so extra thank you for you for taking some time from your very busy schedule to be here with us today. So I was remembering a couple of years ago there was a special screening of the movie No Ordinary Campaign, and you were part of the movie. I remember you were in one of the scenes there, and where you were presenting on behalf of the ALS community before the U.S. Congress, and so you've been fighting this for this cause for a while. We know that, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be talking to you today for our community in Argentina and all the rest of the Spanish-speaking countries. So thank you for that. So yes, we've been talking to Dr. Berry last year about RAPA. Also in 2021, I believe we talked to Dr. Kiernan in Australia about his projects, and he mentioned CNM as one of the projects that excited him the most because of the potential that it still has, and it's good to hear that he's going through this expanded access program stage. When I know it's very hard to answer this question, but when are you expecting to have more results? Is there an approximate date for that? Is the end of this year? Is going to be in
Good
2026?
Good question. So,
Mhm.
CNM AU8 is a product. It has a long half-life. So it takes about a month. And so that means that people have to be on it for a long time. And so part of the analysis that was done previously in the phase two was done to understand how the drug behaves. And so there was some thinking that, the Healy platform phase two, the primary endpoint was at 6 months. And there's thought that that was too early to look at the endpoints for any kind of effect with this particular drug. So, the expanded access program is intended to treat individuals for 144 weeks. So it's like a little bit more than 2.5 years. But we will take interim looks and see if there's any data, especially neurofilament. We'll be following closely to see if it can provide supportive information to their primary. Because remember, expanded access is not a truly controlled experiment. It can't tell us true efficacy, but we can see the neurofilament before they started and neurofilament after, and that can provide support to their already placebo-controlled clinical trials that they're doing and their planned phase three. So it'll be a while. So we started June of last year. So possibly the next cycle. So the grant period ends 2027. And so I anticipate that would be when the expanded access would have fully data readout. I think that's one of the hardest things and one of the biggest asks from the community is we got all this funding and there's many EAP programs, but they're not hearing enough. And so I have been, and the other principal investigators have been trying to make sure we communicate the status and where we are. Is it open for enrollment? Is it fully enrolled? Where are we? And what to expect in the future. Clean Nanomedicine is the company that makes CNM AU8, and they're planning to launch a phase three trial, and hopefully that'll be end of this year or maybe early next year as well. So that's ongoing. They try to do webinars to try to keep and release press releases as they communicate with the Food and Drug Agency in the US.
And I should also mention that we've been also talking to Dr. Paganoni and Dr. Sukowicz from the Healy platform, and they've been informing us about CNM and on all the rest of
Yes.
the regimens in that platform, which is wonderful. And again, as you just said, it's a hard ask to tell people to wait, to tell
Yeah.
ALS patients to wait, but sometimes waiting pays off. And Tofersen is a great example.
Yeah.
Uh, Tofersen was a great victory for our field we had a couple of setbacks in the last couple of years, but the first one was definitely a great victory, and it showed that sometimes if you wait a little longer, then you
Right.
can see that efficacy that you've been looking for, right? Is that correct?
That's correct. Because the primary endpoint, I was an investigator for that study. The primary endpoint of the pivotal study was set at 6 months. If we just stopped there, it would be a failure, actually. And so we saw the movements in the biomarkers, but we didn't see a statistically significant difference. It's when we extended into the open label extension that we start to see the clinical improvements that come after the changes in the biomarkers. So in 6 months, we were able to see that tofersen lowered neurofilament, it lowered SOD, but we didn't see the clinical improvement. There was a lag after that, right? So sometimes we have to wait. And then the other thing is the product itself, right? Remember, every experimental therapy behaves differently. So some of these have very short half-lives and build up in the system fast, and we can get to a faster result. Some of these take a little bit more time. And so the behavior, or what we call pharmacokinetics of the drug, the behavior of the drug in your body, and how long it takes to accumulate in your body, it actually makes a difference on how fast we can read out effect in ALS. We just want answers fast, and we want the cure fast. But sometimes we have to be patient. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is that, there were not that many clinical trials. When I first entered in 2005, it would be just one large clinical trial, and then it would stop. Then there would be one other, just come in sequence. Now there's many more, which is great for our community. But also people really want something that works. We had some setbacks these past few years, and if they want me to provide them something, they want something that actually they can sense a change, they can feel the difference, that it has an impact. So sometimes that takes time to develop.
Absolutely. Yes, that is true. So let's talk about the current political landscape in the US. We talked to Dr. Richard Bedlack last month,
Mhm.
and he told us about all the about how this is impacting the field. We are having a very similar situation in very similar situation in Argentina. There's been a lot of cuts, budget cuts with science, with research and education, health, etc. So uh, you said that you are lucky enough that to still have funds from before, thanks to
Yeah.
the act. But how are you expecting to affect? How are you expecting this to affect, to impact the the future projects? I know it's already impacting. I heard you actually. I heard you in March. You gave the International Alliance an update, and you said that you have been hearing announcements and then measures being taken after those, just a few days after those announcements were being made.
So I
So
will
yeah,
say, yeah, so in the US, I will say that in the current landscape, when they announce something, the government acts very quickly. And so we always have to remain vigilant and not afraid to say how important the research is. And it's not just what I learned, it's not just the scientists who have the funding or the clinical researchers. So I was asked, I'll be very transparent. I was asked by the government to meet with them to explain how I use the funds, what it meant for people living with ALS, why the project is important for our community, and why it's important for the United States. Why is it important for people living in the United States? So I did also use facts about how prevalent neurodegenerative diseases. So I didn't just make ALS. I grouped all the neurodegenerative diseases together, which makes a bigger impact. And I also emphasized how if we don't work on trying to find a cure or to help keep people strong, that it will be an economic burden for our government in the future. And in ALS, there's going to be a 70% increase by 2040 globally, right? So that's the predicted increase in incidence. So, and we still don't even understand all the environmental factors to accurately predict that. So I think making that emphasis about the impact to people within your country, the impact of the government impact and the economic impact made a difference. I don't know. There's nothing that in this landscape I could tell you today everything's fine, tomorrow might be different. So I think it's important to, as researchers, we should be actually unafraid and brave to talk about the importance of the research we're doing. The second is really making sure that people who are experiencing the disease, whether they're taking care of somebody or actually have ALS, they should really be visible and not be afraid to share their stories. So I've been fortunate that I take care of people who were willing to go to their representatives in their state or region and ask them or write a letter or share their story. And when I was able to talk to individuals within Congress in the United States, these individuals had an interest. So there's a group of people in Congress that are very interested in ALS and ALS research because they've heard from people living with ALS or they themselves had somebody living with ALS. And I think that's what really helps to get some movement or some awareness. It's really important for government agencies that are involved in healthcare and research to really know someone with the disease. And they feel it when they hear from somebody. The last is to make sure that advocacy organizations all speak with one voice. So we have, United States is big, we have lots of organizations. And when we are sitting in this landscape, we want to make sure we prioritize the message. So if I'm saying something and someone living with ALS is saying something, and the advocacy organization is saying something, we got to make sure our voice is one. When we speak as one, we had much more traction in gaining awareness and gaining some sympathy, but also hearing, hearing the same message across the board, repetition. So in government, there's many other things that draw the attention of Congress and the government. So trying to get the same message. And the last thing I say is I did go, with the help of IMALS, I did actually work with a group called the Cures Collective. So this is trying to get organizations in Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, MS, to join forces with ALS. And so IMALS is one, but ALS Association, MDA, Les Turner, everybody, all the ALS organizations are there. And we're speaking as one voice as neurodegenerative disease, which creates a lot more power. So I think in that way, we were able to keep some of our funding. So from February to today, we still have our funding. I don't know what the future brings, but one of the major threats to our research right now is that ACT in the United States, a law has to be reauthorized every so often. So ACT for ALS will need reauthorization by the end of this year. If it doesn't get reauthorized, we lose $75 million, and all these programs will no longer exist, and we will not have opportunity. So that means the natural history studies, the biorepository, the expanded access programs, future expanded access programs, basic biological research will be impacted. So right now, our attention has turned to really making sure that ACT for ALS in the United States gets reauthorized.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, so lastly, to wrap up, you are a US-based researcher, but we know that you have a global mind. You are in permanent contact with groups from all over the world. So, how would you say to a researcher, an individual researcher in Argentina or in Uruguay or in Peru, that is now thinking, that's not for me. I'm too far away. I would love to do more for ALS. I would love to be involved in ALS clinical trials and ALS research, but that's too far away from me. I don't see how I can be involved in this. What would you say to them?
That is a great question, I will say, because I never thought ever that I would be in the position I'm in today. And it really is, it only in any country, it really takes one or two people, or it takes one or two families. And then if the passion is there, so I want to have the motivation to do it, right? So if you're a singular researcher or a singular clinician, you have to have the interest and motivation to grow ALS, for example. So you might not want to do something global or advocacy or things like that. We just start small. You focus on either the research or the clinical care for that ALS in that area, in the small city you might be in. But then it's really important if you want to do something bigger. Networking is always important. It's very difficult. As a young researcher, I did not, and my family was not wealthy by any means. They were immigrants to the United States. And, getting to research, even though I was a doctor, I'm still paying loans. I couldn't get to these meetings to network. But networking is made easier with Zoom and phone calls. But trying to find others who are in your area that may be interested and having meetings with them to figure out how they can start on their own, and then you guys link. The other step I think that's very important is trying to connect with people who are doing this, right? And this is where Neals comes in. So we've had people reach out to us. They say, oh, I'm one person in this region that's doing this. We need some help. So we've had investigators from Neals fly out to different countries. I've definitely had people who are interested in starting their own clinics fly to come stay with me and go through the clinic and clinical trials with me. So mentorship is very important, and it doesn't have to be Neals. It could be NCALs in Europe, it could be PACTALs in Asia, it could be ELITAM, it could be ALS Africa. Someone reaching out to someone who knows and not being afraid to make that connection. The third step is really trying to make sure that if there is a family that's interested in being vocal and advocating, creating an advocacy organization along with a clinic and research is magic. Once you do that, then growth happens quick. But usually the passion comes from the family affected with ALS. It's like unstoppable, unstoppable energy. And if you get one person, one family that's interested, they will push and keep you motivated. And then the last is really understanding your regulatory system for drug approvals and your research funding agencies. So is it nonprofits? Is it government agencies that fund research? Because you will need to know all of this to kind of work with pharmaceutical companies to bring them into your country. So it essentially, I highlighted number one, growing your own self first, then networking to create clinics or clinical research centers or collaborative research within the region, then mentorship with other seasoned researchers and clinical consortiums or individualized mentorship, and then advocacy organization, regulatory authority, and then pharmaceutical and bringing them in. Typically, I think all the consortiums now cover most of the globe. So if whatever region you're in, there's likely a consortium that's going to help you. They may not be in your country, but there's a consortium that will help you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you so much, Dr. Andrews, for giving this amazing presentation for us, for all our community, for sharing some time with us. This been excellent. So again, and thank you for keep pushing, for keep working for ALS, for our patients and families, not only in the US, in all over the world. So we are really looking forward to hearing more news about your projects and Neil's projects and CNM,
Yes.
of course, and all the rest of the products that are really looking promising. And maybe we will see you in Toronto
Yes.
by the end of this year, hopefully.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm looking forward
Okay.
to it. Think big. That's all I say. I was never scared to think really big and be unconventional, but that's what we have to do as a global community.
Thank you so much, Jinsey. So see you next time.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.